Spinoza and Stoicism, similarities and differences. The Stoics are one of those philosophies that it's always present in the background in our channel. It's one of those things that when we started this project 12 years ago, I had no idea how relevant it would become to me personally, and how many of the ideas of the Stoics would end up influencing my own personal growth. And so, it's something that I think about all the time, and it's been really helpful for me. I feel like there's a couple things that we can learn from the Stoics today. So let's talk about what Spinoza thought about the Stoics, and how he was both similar to them and different than them. We love doing these deep dives into the history of philosophy. If you'd like to learn more about the great thinkers of the past, be sure to hit subscribe. Baruch Spinoza was born in the year 1632 in the city of Amsterdam. His parents were part of a group of people called Marranos, which refers to Jews who outwardly converted to Christianity but secretly continued to practice Judaism. Now, by the time Spinoza was born, most of his family had outwardly converted as well, although there is some evidence that they continued to practice their faith in secret, and Spinoza himself would follow a similar path. At age 20, he moved out of his family home to avoid an arranged marriage. Around the same time, he began corresponding with some important Jewish scholars and developed his own philosophical views. In 1660, his friends published a collection of letters that showcased his controversial views on the nature of God. And as a result, he was formally excommunicated from the Jewish community at age 24. This event had a huge impact on his life and work, and he responded to it by writing a book called Theologico-Political Treatise, in which he defended his controversial claims about God. Now, when Spinoza wrote this book, he was careful to obscure his identity because he was concerned about being arrested and put to death. He didn't reveal his name, he used a pseudonym instead, and he didn't publish the book in his native Dutch, but instead published it in Latin, which was the common language of scholarship at the time. But even though he tried to hide his identity, the book was seen as controversial and heretical. So he went ahead and published another book, The Ethics, again using a pseudonym and not publishing in his native Dutch. However, by this point Spinoza had gained a reputation as a radical philosopher, and those two books were enough to get him fired from his job as a lens grinder and ultimately led to him living the remainder of his life in poverty. That is until he met a wealthy pensioner who became his close friend and secured his financial future. Still, despite having enough money to live comfortably for the rest of his life, Spinoza continued to write. He produced a number of important works during this period, including a treatise on the improvement of the understanding, which outlined his view that human knowledge mirrors the nature of reality. And he also published his magnum opus, The Ethics, posthumously. Spinoza died on February 21, 1677, just a few weeks after learning that he had a terminal brain tumor. He continued working on his philosophy up until the day he died, and left behind a legacy that inspired generations of philosophers and scientists. One of the first things that we should consider when comparing the Stoics and Spinoza is that Spinoza is not actually a Stoic. Instead, he's someone who lived during the same time period and grappled with some of the same questions that the Stoics did. So in some ways it makes sense to compare him to the Stoics, but at the same time, it's important to remember that he's not a Stoic. And this is a distinction that will become increasingly important as we go along. What I mean is that the Stoics are a collection of individuals who over the course of centuries built up a particular tradition of thought and practice that culminated in the philosophy that we're familiar with today. On the other hand, Spinoza is one individual among many who helped shape the landscape of philosophical thought during the 17th century. And so even though there are similarities between his views and the views of the Stoics, there are also significant differences. So let's start with the similarities. One of the most obvious similarities between Spinoza and the Stoics is their view about the nature of good and evil. For the Stoics, good is what accords with nature, and evil is what doesn't accord with nature. Similarly, for Spinoza, good is what is in accordance with nature, and evil is what is not in accordance with nature. Both traditions also believe that we have control over our thoughts and actions, and that we're responsible for our own happiness. The Stoics refer to this idea as the dichotomy of control, and Spinoza refers to it as his fourth kind of thing, which he describes in the Ethics. Now, there are some differences here too. For the Stoics, nature refers to the rational order of the cosmos, whereas for Spinoza, nature refers to a single substance that he calls God or nature. And both of these views lead to some interesting differences in their ethics. For the Stoics, following nature means following the rational order of the cosmos, whereas for Spinoza, following nature means following the laws of the single substance that he calls God or nature. In both cases, though, they arrive at similar conclusions about how we ought to live our lives. For example, both traditions argue that we should be virtuous and act virtuously, and that virtue is the highest good. They also both argue that we should strive for happiness, and that happiness is the ultimate goal of life. Finally, both traditions agree that we should be indifferent to external things, because they don't ultimately matter for our happiness. Another similarity between Spinoza and the Stoics is their view on the nature of the self. Both traditions believe that the self is more than just a physical body, and that it has a rational component as well. This is why the Stoics refer to themselves as philosophers, since they believe that the goal of life is to seek wisdom. And it's also why Spinoza argues for a threefold division of the mind, which consists of the rational, the irrational, and the sensitive. Now, as you might imagine, there are some differences here as well. The Stoics believed that the soul was immortal and that it could be separated from the body and live on after death. On the other hand, Spinoza believed that the soul is not immortal and that it ceases to exist when the body dies. Additionally, the Stoics believed that the emotions could be harmful or helpful depending on how they're managed, whereas Spinoza believed that the emotions are always harmful and should be avoided. Finally, we should consider their views on God. Now, both Spinoza and the Stoics were theists, and they both believed that God is the ultimate source of all things. However, they differ significantly in their understanding of God. For the Stoics, God is the rational order of the cosmos, whereas for Spinoza, God is a single substance that he calls natura naturans, or God the infinite. In fact, Spinoza argued that God or nature is the only thing that exists, and that everything else is merely a modification of God or nature. This is what he means when he says that God or nature is his starting point and his last word. In other words, when Spinoza says that God or nature is his starting point, he means that nothing exists independently of God or nature. Everything comes from God or nature and depends upon God or nature for its existence. When he says that God or nature is his last word, he means that everything can ultimately be explained in terms of God or nature. Nothing happens without God or nature. This view stands in stark contrast to the Stoics, who believe that God or nature is the rational order of the cosmos. In other words, God or nature is the rational principles that govern the universe and everything in it. So in conclusion, we can see that there are both similarities and differences between Spinoza and the Stoics. They both offer valuable insights into how we ought to live our lives, but they do so from different perspectives. The Stoics offer us a way of living that's rooted in the rational order of the cosmos, whereas Spinoza offers us a way of living that's rooted in the laws of a single substance that he calls God or nature. Ultimately, though, both traditions offer us a path to wisdom and happiness, and for that, I'm grateful to both of them. All right, everyone. That's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed this brief overview of Spinoza's philosophy and his relationship to the Stoics. If you want to learn more about Spinoza, I highly recommend reading his Ethics. It's not as difficult as it looks, and it's well worth the effort. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.